Good evening and welcome to CYC News, the 5th of March 2017 and the 26th of Amshir 1733 AM. I'm Andrew Nada, and in today's headlines: Kill every infidel. Christians flee ISIS terror purge in Egypt. Aleppo resort accuses all sides of brutal war crimes. US slams Russian veto of UN resolution on Syria chemical weapons use. Abbas: Palestinians will work with Trump for a two-state solution. World's most threatening superbugs ranked in new list. And the IOC warns Tokyo 2020 over men-only golf course. To our top story in Egypt, where scores of Coptic Christian families fleeing from Islamic terrorists in the Sinai Peninsula arrived in the governorate of Ismailia over the weekend. ISIS calls Egyptian Christians their favorite prey, and the terror group is saying its fighters are under Allah's orders to kill every infidel. These ISIS-affiliated terrorists in the Sinai Peninsula have stepped up attacks against Egypt's Coptic Christian community in the town of El Arshish in northern Sinai. On Friday, 24th of February, 90 Christian families left their city and headed towards Ismailia Governorate. In the past few weeks, terrorists carried out attacks against Christian families in El Arish, leaving at least 7 people dead. Last week, the terror group released a 20-minute video entitled "Fight All Idolaters," vowing to attack Christians in Egypt and liberate Cairo. Egypt's Christian population makes up about 10% of the population in a Muslim-majority country. Last December, a suicide bomber killed at least 29 Copts, mainly women and children, in Cairo's St. Peter and St. Paul Church. Egyptian state media reported that the Diocese of Ismailia is providing support for families through basics such as mattresses and blankets are still needed. The Anglican Church in Ismailia took in about 150 people who have been housed in different areas throughout the city, including a youth hostel. According to one media source quoted by the Daily News Egypt, the families left expensive properties and their good memories of El Arish. They do not want to be slaughtered or burned to death. The Coptic Orthodox Church, led by Pope Tawadros II, released a statement saying it is in continuous communication with the assigned officials and the Archbishop of North Sinai to control the situation and mitigate the negative effects of these assaults. Speaking with Daily News Egypt on condition of anonymity, one family member said that 90 families that fled El Arish represent the majority of Coptic residents of the city. In France, Marine Le Pen's bid to become the next French president has hit another stumble after members of the European Parliament voted to lift her immunity from prosecution. The move will allow the French prosecutors to investigate her tweets she sent in December 2015, which showed images of killings by ISIS militants. French law prohibits the distribution of violent images or incitement of terrorism. Announcing the vote whether to lift the immunity, Parliamentary President Antonio Tajani said in a clear majority of members backed the motion. Le Pen declared to comment when contacted by CNN. As member of the European Parliament, Le Pen said, Le Pen, leader of the National Front, enjoys immunity which covers freedom of speech. But that immunity can be lifted if a request is made by the authorities of the person's member state. In this case, the request was made by a prosecutor in Nanterre in the west of Paris. Under French law, the maximum penalty for distributing violent images is 3 years in prison and a fine of up to 70,000 euros or $79,000 US. The lifting of her immunity relates to this case only, and action is unlikely to occur before the first round of voting in April 23. This is not the first time Le Pen's immunity has been lifted by the EU Parliament, which also took a similar step in 2013. That allowed her to be prosecuted in 2015 with incitement to discrimination over people's religious beliefs, after she compared Muslims praying in public to the Nazi occupation of France during the Second World War. She was acquitted by the court in Lyon, and Le Pen is already under scrutiny over allegations that her members of her staff were paid for non-existent jobs at the European Parliament. A UN-established commission has issued a damning report on human rights violations in Syria's war-ravaged Aleppo, accusing both sides of the conflict of committing war crimes. The commission gathered evidence to confirm witness accounts that the Syrian and Russian governments used prohibited cluster weaponries on civilians in rebel-held eastern Aleppo, suggesting the deliberate destruction of hospitals with repeated airstrikes, among other violations. Cluster weaponries release smaller bomblets that cover a wider area than regular bombs and are criticized for causing damage beyond intended targets. CNN has reached out to Russian officials and the Syrian mission to the UN for a response to the report, but they have not yet replied. Both countries have in the past denied deliberately targeting hospitals and schools, as well as the use of cluster bombs. The Commission could not always distinguish whether it was Syrian or Russian planes carrying out the particular airstrikes. The report also said that Syrian forces carried out a deadly aid convoy attack in September 2016, giving a harrowing account of how machine guns were fired from aircraft at those who had survived rounds of bombings. The Commission heard more witnesses' testimony of chemical attacks using chlorine gas, saying the evidence pointed to the Syrian regime being behind them. The report said the use of chlorine in attacks was a war crime and showed a blatant disregard for international legal obligations. The Commission said it found no evidence that Russia had used chemical weapons. Both Syria and Russia have denied using chemical weapons, and the report quoted on both sides of the city civilians paid the highest price for the brutality of violence that assailed Aleppo. In eastern Aleppo, pro-government forces pummeled vital civilian infrastructure with disastrous consequences. Day after day, hospitals, markets, water stations, schools, and residential buildings were razed to the ground. It added that civilians in turn avoided hospitals, including pregnant women, who increasingly gave birth at home without medical assistance or opted for caesareans to avoid hours of labor in hospital. In western Aleppo, civilians lived in fear of indiscriminate and deliberate shelling by armed groups, the report said, calling such a shelling a war crime. Abu Qayyar al-Mazri, the number 2 man for Al-Qaeda, behind the leader Ayman al-Zawahiri, has been killed by a missile strike in Idlib, Syria, according to multiple sources. 2 US officials said al-Masri was killed in an attack directed by the US intelligence community. The UK-based activist group Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, or SOHR, told CNN al-Masri was killed on Sunday in a strike targeting his vehicle near al-Mustama village in Idlib. Several Syrian opposition activists also reported al-Masri was killed by a missile strike. Abdullah al-Musayini, a senior member of Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, acknowledged the death in a eulogy posted on his official Telegram channel. He said, "May Allah accept Abu Qayyar in heaven. May Allah gather us together with him." Al-Musayini is a prominent inner leadership member of Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, which used to be known as Al-Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Al-Nusra Front in Syria split from Al-Qaeda last summer with the blessing of Al-Qaeda leader al-Zawahiri. SOHR said al-Masri, whose real name was Abdullah Muhammad Rajab Abdul Rahman, and who was an Egyptian national, was in a car near al-Mustama camp when the strike took place. Syria Civil Defense in Idlib, also known as White Helmets, reported the incident as it posted pictures on its Facebook account. The group reported 2 people were killed in the strike without mentioning their names. In 2005, Abdullah Muhammad Abdul Rahman was designated by the US Treasury Department as a terror supporter. The department said he was responsible for coordinating Al-Qaeda's work with other terrorist organizations. In 2016, the UN Security Council put him, along with 81 others, on a sanctions list. The Trump administration's new US ambassador to the United Nations strongly denounced Russia and China for vetoing a resolution against Syria. The latest attempt to punish Syrian leaders failed after 2 permanent members voted against a resolution to impose sanctions for Damascus' use of chemical weapons. The first vetoes by Russia and China before US Ambassador Nikki Haley. Russia and China made an outrageous and indefensible choice today, Haley said, speaking in the Security Council chamber after the vote. It is a sad day on the Security Council when members start making excuses for the other member states killing their own people. She continued, "The world is definitely a more dangerous place. Today, the international community can look no further than the Security Council for contributing to that." The veto was the 7th time Russia has blocked a Security Council resolution aimed at the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the past 5 years, protecting its Syrian ally from diplomatic action. An international investigation has found chemical weapons were used by the government forces. Before the veto, French UN Ambassador François Delattre said it is a moment of truth. He demanded that the Council act, asking who couldn't condemn today those attacking innocent women and children with chemical weapons. The vote was 9 in favor, 3 against, as Bolivia joined Russia and China, and 3 abstentions from Egypt, Kazakhstan and Ethiopia. The resolution would have condemned the use of chemical weapons in Syria, a violation of international law, and placed UN sanctions on 21 Syrian scientists, military commanders, and entities alleged to be involved in their use. It is also outlined in an embargo on the sale of certain chemical substances, as well as materials that could be used to transport the weapons, including helicopters. Russia's representative defended its veto, calling it an attempt to retard and undermine the current political and diplomatic efforts in Syria by the Western trio of Permanent Security Council members. Earlier in the day, Russia's state-run news agency TASS quoted President Vladimir Putin as saying, "The new sanctions were totally inappropriate," as peace talks were underway. The resolution references reports from a UN commission and created a behest of Security Council diplomats, including Russia, that concluded the Syrian government had dropped devices with toxic chemicals from helicopters on 3 occasions in 2014 and 15. Russian Deputy Ambassador Vladimir Safronkov questioned the findings of the report based on suspicious and sympathetic sources. Countries calling for the resolution's approval used graphic descriptions of victims of the chemical weapons attacks in blaming Russia for supporting the Assad regime. Those statements seemed to rankle Russia and even China more. Safronkov said, having to do with the outrageous statements made against Russia, China and other states, God shall judge you and they will remain on your conscience. Speaking to the reporters after the vote, UK Ambassador Matthew Rycroft committed to exploring alternative paths towards action on Syria in the wake of repeated failure. Over to Germany, where officials confirmed that hundreds of asylum seekers and refugees were injured in more than 3,500 attacks on them and their shelters in Germany last year. The country's Interior Ministry said on Sunday that 2,545 of the attacks were carried against individual migrants, while 988 targeted places that housed migrants. The data shows that there were over 420 physical attacks and nearly 750 acts of arson and property damage. There were also counted 1,380 verbal attacks that included everything from insults inciting hate speech. Authorities say that preliminary 2016 figures, along with data from previous years, demonstrate an increasing trend of attacks towards migrants. The preliminary figures were released in a response to a parliamentary question. Final figures are expected to be released in May. According to the ministry, 560 asylum seekers and refugees were injured in the attacks, 43 children among them. There were also 217 attacks on refugee organizations and volunteers. Germany has accepted hundreds and thousands of refugees in the past couple of years, many from war-torn Syria. In 2016, 28,000 migrants applied for asylum in the country. The largest group of applicants come from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Eritrea, Albania and Pakistan. The policy has been polarizing, with some parts of the community unhappy with the influx of refugees. The numbers released in 2016 saw a substantial increase in attacks from the prior year. In 2015, officials recorded 1,031 attacks nationwide against asylum seekers. More than 80% of reported attacks in 2015 were verbal assaults. Alongside a breakdown of the figures, the German Interior Minister Heiko Maas tweeted on Sunday that attacks on migrants were attacks on open and free society. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas reaffirmed his commitment to a two-state solution that emphasized his willingness to work with US President Donald Trump to achieve peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Speaking at the opening of the United Nations Human Rights Council session in Geneva on Monday, Abbas called for a Palestine and Israel living side by side on the pre-1967 borders in peace and security. In his speech, in which he claimed a two-state solution could bring peace to the region, he added, "The creation of the state of Palestine will undermine the driving force and terror and extremism, and we are part of the international system combating terrorism." Abbas also used his speech to reiterate his opposition to Trump's campaign promise to move the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a promise which has since been walked back by the new administration, as well as building of a new settlement construction. Danny Danon, Israel's ambassador to the UN, responded by warning that speeches and actions against Israel in international area will not help, and the only means to achieve the solution is through direct negotiations with Israel. They're supposed to be the pillars of unity and peace, where both Jews and non-Jews can enjoy classes, sports, and other communal activities. But more than 100 Jewish community centers have turned into targets of hate, subjected to bomb threats, as fears heightened in anti-Semitism spread across the country. The threats have reached such a crescendo that President Donald Trump used his speech to Congress on Tuesday night to address the issue. President Trump said, "Recent threats targeting Jewish community centers and vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, as well as last week's shooting in Kansas City, remind us that while we may be a nation divided on policies, we are a country that stands in uniting, condemning hate and evil in all its forms, in very ugly forms." President was referring to the toppling of dozens of Jewish headstones in cemeteries in two cities and the shooting of two Indian men in Kansas on February 22nd by assailant who shouted, "Get out of my country." One of the men died. Law enforcement officials believe that many of threatening calls to Jewish community centers have originated overseas. So far, none of the threats have been carried out. But the lack of destruction has not made them any less chaotic or anxiety-inducing. The alarm from bomb threats, combined with the recent vandalism at Jewish cemeteries at St. Louis and Philadelphia, have led some to see a pattern of rising anti-Semitism. The series of bomb threats in recent weeks has disrupted day-to-day life, sparked fear in the tight-knit communities, and raised questions about what the federal government is doing to find out who is responsible. In health, and the World Health Organization has drawn up a list of drug-resistant bacteria that pose the biggest threat to human health. Top of the list are gram-negative bugs such as E. coli, which can cause lethal bloodstream infections and pneumonia in frail hospital patients. The list will be discussed ahead of this summer's G20 meeting in Germany. The aim is to focus the minds of the governments on finding new antibiotics to fight hard-thread infections. Experts have reportedly warned that they are on the cusp of post-antibiotic era, where some infections will be untreatable with existing drugs. Common infections could then spread and kill. Dr. Marie-Paul Keeney from WHO has said antibiotic resistance was reaching alarming proportions, and yet the drug pipeline was practically dry. We are fast running out of treatment options. If we leave it to market forces alone, the new antibiotics we most urgently need are not going to be developed in time. The WHO says that there is a danger that pharmaceutical companies will develop only treatments that are easier and more profitable to make, the low-hanging fruit. The focus should be on clinical need instead, says WHO. Tuberculosis was not included in the list because the search for new treatments for this infection is already being prioritized. Experts drew up the list by looking at current level of drug resistance, global death rates, prevalence of the infections in communities, and the burden the diseases cause on health systems. One of the infections at the top is bacterium called Klebsiella, and recently developed resistance to a powerful class of antibiotics called carbapenems. The US recently reported the fatal case of a woman who was caught with this infection, which could not be treated with any of the 26 different antibiotics available to her doctors. To sport, the International Olympic Committee has warned it will move the Tokyo 2020 golf event from its current venue if it does not admit women. The Kasumigaseki Country Club does not allow women to become full members or play on Sundays. IOC Vice President John Coates said, "I respect it's a private club, but our position is clear. We will only go to a club that has non-discrimination. At some point, there has to be a cutoff." However, Coates added that they did not expect to find another host for the event. His understanding is as recently as this week, there have been more discussions with the club, that it's heading in the right direction for them to have a non-discriminatory membership. In February, club chairman Kiichi Kimura described the controversy as annoying after initial internal discussions had not yet resulted in a decision on Kasumigaseki's membership policy. "We are baffled," he said. "We agreed to host at their request, but we never made a bid." World number 1 and Rio 2016 silver medalist Lydia Ko has said that she wants to see the bar to women at the club lifted, while the Japan Golf Council, a group aimed at modernizing the game, has sent the IOC a letter recommending an alternative course. And that's all for CYC News. A reminder that you can watch the news bulletin again throughout the week on YouTube. I'm Andrew Nada, and from the CYC studios in Sydney, Australia, have a good night.